Welcome to this video workshop about nature journaling and drawing and painting wildflowers. My name is Emily Underwood, and I was thinking that because we're staying at home this spring, it would be a good time to celebrate the season through closer observations of nature and specifically look closely at flowers. And if you aren't able to get out into fields of bloom like these for inspiration, I would encourage you to explore your backyard, whatever's blooming in your neighborhood stroll, or perhaps even the flower section of your local grocery store. So this is what we're going to do in this video. First, we're going to look at some cool things about flower anatomy and pollination, and then we'll do an exercise that looks at wildflowers on a macro scale, so sort of a mapping exercise, and then we'll look closely at flowers on the micro scale and do a dissection. Okay, here is general flower anatomy, and I'm basically going to show what the parts are of a generic blossom. This is the female part. This is the ovary, and up above it is the style, and then on top is the stigma, and all these parts together make up the pistil, the female part of the plant. Then surrounding that part, there's the little anthers, which are the pollen-bearing part, and the filaments. And these anthers and filaments together make the stamens, which there's often many of them. Beneath that is the sepal and the pedicel, which kind of support those reproductive parts. And then in our generic flower here, we also have petals. The position of the ovary in different flowers also varies. Here's an illustration of the three kinds of ovary position. On the left, you have superior ovary position, where everything is attached below the ovary, and that's typical with things like poppies or pea family. In the middle, you have semi-inferior, where the sepals and petals and stamens are at the side, and that's typical for things in the rose family. And then inferior ovary position is where the ovary is below the petals and stamens and everything, and that is what you would see with something like daffodil or flowers in the primrose family. I thought it might be useful to look at some of the anatomy with some common flowers that we know here in springtime in California. Here's a California poppy, and you can see that if you look at the one on the left here, I'm zooming in, you can see that superior ovary, that green little thing in the middle surrounded by the anthers, and that is what matures and becomes the seed pod that you see later on in the season, and it'll kind of grow, and then all the poppy seeds come out of that. You can see at the bottom there's the pedicel, but you might ask, where are the sepals? And poppies are a bit different. Instead of the sepals opening up and staying attached around the bottom of the blossom, they kind of stay like a little dunce cap on top that comes off as the flower matures. So that green kind of cone-shaped thing is actually a fused sepal. Here's another favorite spring wildflower of mine, shooting star, Dodecathon hendersoni. There's lots of different varieties. This is the one that grows here in Carmel Valley where I live. And you can see the reproductive parts there on the end. So the pistil is sticking out there, and then the anthers are kind of tightly arranged all around it. And what's kind of cool about this flower is you can see different phases of its of the flower maturing. And at first it's kind of like the flowers, the petals come down and protect that, and then as you can see in this one, as it gets more mature, they sort of like curl up and make those reproductive parts available to pollinators. And the way this plant is pollinated is really cool too. It's pollinated by bumblebees in a similar way to tomatoes, and this form of pollination is called buzz pollination. And here's a little diagram. You can see that in that picture that anthers have what are called apical pores, and they're sort of like salt shakers. And so in order for the pollen to be released, the bees have to sort of buzz it. And that way only bees can pollinate it because they are able to release that pollen out of those pores. Here's another springtime favorite, the lupin. in the pea family, lots of different types of lupin. And when you look closely at the structure of these plants, you can see, or the flowers, you can see some of the morphology is related to how they're pollinated. So if you look at the keel, so it's the bottom of the flower there, and you pull it down, this little sort of like claw thing comes out, which I was always told was why they were called lupin in the first place, because it relates to the Latin name for wolf. I don't know if that's true, but anyway, bee sits on there, and the anthers that are sitting right there below it kind of push the pollen onto the bee so that it's got plenty of it there so that when it goes to the next flower, it's able to pollinate. Since we're just getting into pollination, there's a lot of cool things you can tell about a flower's pollinator by its morphology. So, like, for instance, bees are really attracted to flowers that are blue or yellow or purple or ultraviolet, which is a color that we can't even see. It's out of the human range. Look at pictures of flowers under ultraviolet filters. It's really cool. They often have a landing platform like we were just talking about, or they'll be shallow or tubular and maybe have a pleasant or mild fresh smell. Birds, mainly hummingbirds, like red or orange or warm bright pink colors, and tubular flowers that only they can get their bills in. Not as fragrant usually. Butterflies also like bright flowers, but they need to sit on something. And so they also kind of like these tubular flowers, but things that are clustered that make a nice landing area, like a verbena or something, with a faint and pleasant smell. Flies are really important pollinators, and they are often attracted to pale or earthy flowers that not many other pollinators would be attracted to. And often these flowers have sort of complicated funnels or trap-like structures, and often maybe putrid smells that flies are attracted to, because we all know what flies like. Moths are also important pollinators, and they pollinate at night. And so the flowers that they are attracted to are white or pale and often very, very fragrant because that is how they're able to find them in the dark. When we're looking at flowers, we can't forget the leaves, because not only are they what's there most of the year when the flowers aren't in bloom, but also they can tell us what we're looking at, and we want to draw it properly when we're drawing it. So there's different kinds of leaf arrangements. Alternate, opposite, opposite leaves four rank, which kind of is more like a three-dimensional kind of opposite arrangement, and whorled, which is like where they all go around in a ring around the stalk. Another thing to notice when you're looking at the leaves of the wildflowers is the shape of the leaves themselves. Are they linear? Are they oblong? Are they elliptical? Are they ovate? And then also the margins of the leaves. Are they crenate or sort of like undulating like poison oak, or maybe more like serrated like a rose or an elderberry? But a good thing to notice and draw when you're making these observations, because they'll help you figure out what plant you're looking at. So now we're going to do an exercise that's about mapping and looking at patterns of where things are blooming across a landscape. And I'm going to show you an example of where I did this at my house, which is, I live rurally, so, but I can imagine ways to do this in a city. If you have a walk you go on, you could take photographs of things that are blooming on your walk or blooming trees. Or if you're able to get out to a park, or I'll show you at the end an example of somebody who did this in the city. But there's lots of different ways to do this, even if you aren't out someplace rural. So the way this exercise works is not only do you notice what is blooming, but also where in the landscape is blooming. And so you make a little map of the route you take and what you saw along the way. And so each flower that I painted, I also assigned a little symbol. And then I can put that symbol on sort of my rough map of where I went. And that way my journal page becomes not only an observation of what I saw, but where I saw it. So here I've seen fiesta flowers and the baby blue eyes, and I've drawn them. And then I'm adding also information about what trees I see. So down at the lower part of my walk, I saw live oaks, and I have a little directional symbol there indicating which way is north. And then when I see the shooting stars further on the walk, I make a symbol for those. And I'm also adding little arrows to show which way the slopes are facing and where water is flowing down, and more information about what trees I see. So as I go up the hill, I see less live oaks and more blue oaks and buckeyes, and that's where I see the lupin. And so this way my map has all that kind of information in it, in addition to just what I saw. And then after I kind of sketch it out, I like to sort of add a little bit more watercolor on there to sort of show how there's how the land, kind of just a little map of the landscape. And it doesn't necessarily have to be exact, because that's kind of not the point of this journal exercise, isn't to show somebody where to go, but just sort of as a memory of your journey and what you saw. And that's what's kind of nice about a nature journal, is it gets to be something personal for you. And so I like to have fun with lettering and write little notes. And that's the first exercise. That is the macro mapping. Here's an example of a woman who lives in San Francisco named Lori Wiggum. And she did this near her house where she lives in Bernal Hill. And so it's similar, but she has a different format. She has like a long sort of accordion folding page, and she has these close-ups of the flower, and she did a good observations of some of the flower morphology and also made the map showing where they are near her house. The last thing we're going to do is look closely at a flower by doing a dissection and pulling apart and looking for all the parts of the flowers that we were talking about earlier. So the first thing I do, I have an apple blossom here, is get sort of a gesture sketch. Before I pull any of the flowers off the branch or pull them apart, I like to do a drawing that just sort of shows how they are arranged on the branch, how the flowers are in relationship to the leaves, noticing some of those aspects, and then I just do a rough pencil sketch. And now you can see I'm going over with a waterproof pen and taking off the graphite, and I have a little pen sketch there, and then I fill in with watercolor. And so the way I like to use watercolor is going from light to dark. So I'm putting in sort of the lightest greens first, a little bit of yellow for where the anthers are. This particular apple blossom has a blush of pink, so put that on, mixing up some darker green to go over once that under layer has dried, filling in sort of the dark spots in between the flowers. It's a lot of times those negative spaces that you want to define with the paint to show how particularly white petals will show up better if there's something green behind them. A little bit of the shadow and more of the blush of the apple blossoms. So kind of slowly just going through, getting a little bit more, working into those darker divots and trying to get that overall color and form of the branch, and putting a couple extra details, little branch. And then if you have a hand lens, it's kind of helpful now to be able to look closer at the parts. So again, I'm doing a sketch. I'm looking at just the top view of the flower, which is another nice view to make before, or to draw before you start pulling apart the pieces and looking for the reproductive parts. But I'm just showing what it looks like if I look down at one flower, getting the arrangement of the petals. Here I'm adding some of the anthers and then drawing again with that waterproof pen over my graphite. Some sepals, and using my eraser to take the graphite off before I start adding the shadow and blush of the white flower. And white flowers can be tricky on white paper because it's hard to get things to show up when they're the same color as the background. But adding some of these dark areas in between will help define the shape of the petals. Here I'm adding just some more shadow, a little bit more of the blush color on the leaves, some more. Here I'm taking the flower apart, and I have a scalpel, but you could also use scissors, and I'm getting a longitudinal view so that I can get a better view of some of those details. And it's hard to get in focus here, but if you have a hand lens, you can find the ovary, see what the ovary position is, and see how those anthers and stamens are attached. Again, sketching those details out with a pencil, and then again with the waterproof pen. And there's lots of different ways you can arrange your page. You know, this is just the way that I like to do it, but I really do like to have a cross section on there somewhere. So you're going to go in with the shadow colors again. And after I do the longitudinal view, I like to go even find, sometimes pull out some of the anthers or stamens and draw those even closer. For this one, after I finished this, I wanted to show, I was interested in showing the way that the buds develop, and so I found the youngest tight sort of pink bud and drew that one. Here's a sepal and added the pink in the shadows. Another fun thing you could do if you have a flower that's opening over a few days is in your journal, draw it every day in. So on this one, I had a bunch of different flowers that are in different stages of development. But another way you could do this is have something opening day after day and show it sort of as like a timeline, which now I think about it is kind of a nice way to do this exercise, because I don't know how you guys are feeling, but the way that time has been passing in this weird quarantine era is strange, and it might kind of be a fun way to mark the passage of the days or something. I don't know. But so yeah, I like to add labels and play with lettering and a little bit more watercolor just to finish it off. And that's it. Thank you. My name's Emily Underwood. Please feel free to email me if you have any questions. And I will have another video that goes over materials that might be useful to do these exercises and some other resources. So thanks for watching.